Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Today, we are going to talk about some ways that trauma and anxiety can be connected. We are in the middle of a series of podcast episodes on anxiety, and last week we set some of the groundwork by exploring what trauma actually is from an emotional and theological standpoint. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, I encourage you to go back and listen. But as a quick recap, here are some of the key definitions of trauma that we covered. Essentially, trauma is a lasting emotional response that results from living through a distressing experience where we felt alone, overwhelmed, and powerless in our pain. Gabor Mate, a physician and author, defines trauma as this: trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. Despite common belief, trauma is not necessarily what happens to you. Rather, trauma is what happens inside of you because of the things that happen to you. From a theological standpoint, trauma is the byproduct of living in a fallen world and became a reality when sin did. As my friend Ashley, who is certified in narrative-focused trauma care, says, trauma is the sustained effects of being sinned against. Today, as we continue to explore this topic, it's important for us to understand that some form of trauma, whether big or small, touches all of our lives in some way. Being impacted by trauma is part of the human experience, and if we were to each look back on our stories, I think we'd all be able to pinpoint some instances where trauma has intersected our lives and had a role in shaping who we are today. And here is where we begin to see where anxiety and trauma can be linked. The anxiety that we feel today isn't random. Oftentimes, the anxiety that we currently feel is rooted in our stories, and the answer to why we feel the way that we feel emerges as we begin to reflect back on the hurt, havoc, and harm that we've experienced in the past. So in this episode, I'm going to highlight 3 specific ways that trauma and anxiety can be connected. It's important to note that there are many underlying causes for patterns of anxiety in our lives, not just traumatic events. So as you listen, I want to invite you to simply be curious if there is a particular point or connection that resonates with you. Let's jump into the first connection. Trauma overloads your nervous system. And when you feel constantly overwhelmed by any negative emotion, your nervous system can eventually get stuck in overdrive, resulting in anxiety. Early experiences of trauma play a huge role in shaping our nervous systems. Through our experiences of trauma as children, we form perceptions and beliefs about what is physically or emotionally safe and unsafe in our worlds. Adult anxiety commonly emerges from childhoods that were unpredictable, volatile, or always changing. If parts of your childhood felt more unsafe than safe, your nervous system developed to accommodate this constant sense of unsafety. Your body may have gotten used to staying hyper-vigilant and on high alert, and your brain was primed to stay on edge because you never knew what was coming or what to expect. And now, even though you're not a child anymore, your body may still be living in that story of unsafety, hence the anxiety that you're presently experiencing. Do you see how anxiety and childhood trauma are so strongly linked here? All of these factors are really important to consider as we dig deeper into the stories behind our anxiety. Let's move on to the next connection between trauma and anxiety. Trauma results in negative core beliefs that aren't true, but that we can live out of, which fuels anxiety. Trauma almost always results in deeply ingrained beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world that aren't true, but that feel deeply true. So true that we don't even recognize that we are often living out of these particular beliefs until we start reflecting more intentionally on our stories. When I started counseling at 18, I began looking back on my childhood and naming some of the beliefs that I'd picked up along the way. And one of the primary messages that I had interpreted was, "You are not enough." And since by nature, anxiety tells us that we aren't capable, it makes sense that anxiety was a resulting factor. As I realized this belief, I began to trace some of the formative moments and messaging in my childhood that had caused me to begin living out of a place of not enoughness. Surprisingly, I recognized that most of the experiences that had contributed to this belief seemed so small. They happened in the ordinary course of everyday life, but they had a profound and long-lasting impact. One story in particular happened in Sunday school when I was 10 years old. I grew up as a pastor's kid and then a missionary kid, and when I was 9, my family moved to East Asia to partner with local churches in efforts to eventually plant a bilingual church in the area. My family was heavily involved in the ministries at both of these local churches, and we would attend their Sunday services weekly. My twin sister and I immediately started attending Sunday school as well, and I remember being so excited the first time I went to Japanese Sunday school. I could not wait to make new friends. I remember walking into church that first Sunday wearing a new dress and a huge smile on my face. But it didn't take long for it to dawn on me. I couldn't speak Japanese, and this meant that I didn't know how to talk to my classmates or understand what my teachers were saying. I didn't even know how to say my own name in Japanese, let alone comprehend the Bible story that we were being taught or read out of the Japanese Bible that I had been given. I didn't know the rules of the games that we played. I didn't know what was culturally and socially acceptable or not. I'd never tasted the snack that I was given and felt so embarrassed by the cultural mistakes that I constantly seemed to make. As the weeks passed, I slowly settled into the belief that something was very different about me, that I was a burden, and that perhaps I didn't have what it took to belong. Then, a few months later, one of my Sunday school teachers told me, with lots of broken English and Japanese and hand gesturing, that the class was going to be reciting the 10 Commandments in Japanese in one of the Sunday services the following month. She gave me the 10 Commandments in Japanese well before my peers so that I could have ample time to memorize them. As a 10-year-old, I remember thinking, this is my moment. I would not just memorize the 10 Commandments, I would recite them flawlessly. This was my opportunity to prove myself. This was my opportunity to show that I was enough. I spent hours and hours memorizing this Japanese scripture passage. By the time it came to recite them in church, I knew the 10 Commandments so well that I was reciting them in my dreams. I knew them in Japanese better than I knew them in English. I remember going to church that day feeling excited and a little nervous. When the time came, my Sunday school class filed in front of the congregation and began reciting what we had practiced. But something happened that I hadn't anticipated. My classmates were just as nervous as I was, which caused the majority of us to race through the 10 Commandments much faster than when we had previously practiced. As heat flushed my body, I remember standing frozen in front of the congregation. I tried to stumble along, but the pace was too fast. I couldn't keep up. Barely holding back tears, I wanted to disappear, vanish, sink into the floor, anything to escape this moment. Afterwards, I remember one of my Sunday school teachers coming up to me with disappointment in her eyes. "Did you prepare at all?" she asked me. I stared up at her, eyes wide, as shame and a gut-wrenching sense of failure washed over me. I didn't even have the words in my limited Japanese vocabulary to tell her how hard I had prepared. Later that morning, I burst into tears in the church's bathroom. Inwardly, it had been resolutely determined. I was not enough. By myself in the bathroom that day, I solemnly vowed that this would never happen again. I would always be prepared. I would never, ever be in a situation again where I felt so inadequate. Anxiety became a constant companion as I began to live out of a place of striving, fear, and not enoughness. And this is just one story. We all have so many stories like this one. Moments and experiences that, on the surface, appear to be ordinary and seemingly trivial, but that profoundly shape our perceptions of ourselves and fuel the beliefs that we live our lives out of. Through this story, hopefully you've begun to see the formative power of perception and the interpretations that we come to in our first experiences of pain. Oftentimes, the experiences that have most formed who we are today are hidden in the smallest of moments. That seemingly harmless comment, an experience of being shamed during your childhood, the lack of attunement to your pain. No moment is too small to discount. Briefly interrupting this episode to invite you to the Faith and Feelings Substack, a weekly Wednesday email and reader's favorite that allows us to continue the conversation we start here on the podcast. These emails include personalized resources, recommended links, and reflection questions designed to help you process each week's episode more deeply, both individually and in community. Click the link in this episode's show notes to become a paid subscriber for just $5 a month and begin investing in your own spiritual and emotional health today. The last way that trauma and anxiety can be connected stem from the previous 2 points. I've said this before, but I want to say it again because it's so important. The anxiety that you experience today may be an indicator that you are feeling or your body is registering something that is connected to your past story, and it's significant. A couple weeks ago, I had a conversation with someone that evoked some anxiety and shame responses in me. During the conversation, I immediately noticed my body feeling emotionally flooded. My reaction seemed so much stronger than a typical emotional response that I began to wonder if there was something deeper going on inside of me. A few days later, I brought the situation up with my therapist and asked if we could process it. I told her about the conversation and how my reaction seemed to happen without my control but felt so much bigger than what seemed normal for the scenario. "I'm confused," I remember telling her. "I don't know where that reaction came from." She looked at me thoughtfully and then gently asked me, "Do you remember a time in your childhood where you felt the same way?" I tilted my head to the side and started thinking back, and then immediately started crying. Yes, the shame-anxiety response that I had felt during the conversation was linked to some really painful experiences and emotions that I had first felt during my childhood and that I hadn't realized were connected until now. Experiences of trauma generate emotions, and unless we process these emotions when they occur, they can become stuck in our systems. This negatively affects us both psychologically and physically. A healthy flow and processing of distressing emotions like anger, sadness, grief, and fear are essential for healthy functioning. When these emotions remain suppressed and unprocessed inside of us, they don't just go away. They become toxic and can fuel damaging beliefs and unhealthy patterns in our lives. When I began processing parts of my story at 18, I slowly began to realize that those feelings of shame and failure, among other emotions that I had experienced as a little girl, were still inside of me. Anxiety is a signal. It's often our body's indicator that we are feeling some difficult or unprocessed emotions connected to our childhoods that are still inside of us. We may have put aside or suppressed these emotions, but in a way, our anxiety in the present moment is extending an invitation to process them. Now, if you were raised in a faith context like me, you might be familiar with John 8:31 and 32, which says, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." When we talk about this verse, we often emphasize Jesus' promise that the knowledge of truth will set us free. But Jesus is also saying something else here. By telling his disciples that the truth will set them free, he is simultaneously saying that they are in bondage to lies. I want to hone in on this verse for a minute and ask you a question. Where do you think these lies come from? We often think that Jesus is referring to lies from the world or from the kingdom of darkness, and while this is certainly true, we can often overlook our bondage to lies that have resulted from the pain, woundedness, and trauma in our own hearts and stories. We step into the freedom that Jesus offers us, not by simply knowing the truth cognitively, but by understanding the ways that we are currently living and operating out of a place of bondage. We have to understand how our hearts have come into agreement with lies and how our identities and self-perceptions have been formed and built upon years and layers of untruth. Because these beliefs are deeply ingrained in us, forming our worldviews and our personal narratives. Transformation happens as we experience the truth of the gospel applied specifically to our own hearts. The invitation of Jesus is to step into freedom that runs deeper than just replacing truth with untruth, but of breaking loyalty and agreement to thought patterns that have driven our lives. In this week's Substack, I'm going to be including a resource that will guide you in identifying a childhood story similar to my Sunday school story to reflect on more deeply. And if you're listening to this episode after Wednesday, you can still get this resource. When you subscribe to my Substack, you'll also get access to a library of all of my previous Substack emails and resources. But as we wrap up this episode, what's a practical shift that we can make this week in how we engage with our anxiety, especially when we get a sense that it's connected to some past hurts or difficult experiences? I love how trauma therapist Kobe Campbell talks about the process of healing from trauma. She says, healing from trauma rarely starts with an action, but where we put our attention. So this week, I want to invite you to simply start listening to your own inner dialogue. What are you telling yourself about who you are? What phrases or words are on repeat inside of you? Write down whatever surfaces. Can you identify any untruths? If so, begin to consider, where do you think these lies came from? Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.